Okay. Just one quick note of housekeeping. We have had some room changes. Instead of listing them and going on, please just consult the poster board at the concierge desk right outside the room. And given that we have an intimate group today, I invite you all to actually move towards the front tables. So if you're kind of in the back half of the room, please come up and fill these tables right up front so we can have a more intimate discussion.
Okay. Thank you very much for coming to this of the other 4 choices that you had, or the 5 choices that you had in all. Thanks for coming to this. We have a remarkable panel today, 2 of whose members in recent days professed that they had no direct experience hands-on with this subject matter, but I know that you'll agree by the end of this that they bring some very relevant insights to our discussion, and that's because I'd like to broaden this discussion, bring it home to America, and with what you might call a solutions-oriented discussion. I want to begin with a couple of very short excerpts from the PBS NewsHour that I think can illuminate the discussion and talk a little bit about what it is we're going to be looking at, what we're going to be talking about. It is basically getting cleaner fuel to some 2 billion people for their sake and for ours. And how do you do this? Find a sustainable market-based solution in a market of people who earn less than $2 a day. So let me start by rolling a couple of minutes of this recent segment that aired just before the Copenhagen summit.
Climate change, a look at reducing global warming one stove at a time. Special correspondent Fred DeSam Lazaro reports from a village in North India.
It's sunny most mornings in Kairatpur, but you can hardly tell, at least not until some time after everyone's had breakfast. That's because here and in millions of villages in the developing world, food is cooked with wood or cow dung. The soot or black carbon from incomplete combustion causes not only lung disease but global warming, says climatologist V. Ramanathan, who's with the Scripps Institution at the University of California, San Diego.
And this is being done by over 3 billion people in the world, not because they want to destroy the environment. They have no access to other types of fuels.
He says reducing black carbon will immediately slow global warming. Cleaning up diesel engines is one way to do this, but Ramanathan is focused on cleaner cooking. He's doing an experiment. With UN and private grants, his Surya project is handing out cleaner burning stoves to 15,000 households in and around Kairatpur. They use biofuels, but have a solar-charged internal fan to burn more efficiently.
So that instrument measures black carbon.
Over the next 2 years, the team will measure what the cleaner stoves do for air quality, hoping to make a strong case for scaling up this idea.
The preliminary data shows if we replace the current way of cooking, we should see a dramatic impact. First on the health, second on the air quality, and hopefully on regional climate.
Ramanathan's call to reduce black carbon is supported in a recent U.S. government report. Some advocates wanted this issue on the agenda of the Copenhagen Climate Summit. But there are skeptics. Rajendra Pachauri, chair of the Nobel Prize-winning Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change, says we don't yet know enough about black carbon. And he says there's no quick climate dividend. Getting billions of people to abruptly change the way they cook just isn't practical.
If one uses that argument, I would say that running faster trains in North America and providing public transport in a city like Houston is so much more a logical solution than people driving gas-guzzling cars and SUVs. So, these things are not decided by merely back-of-the-envelope calculations. If you ask people to give up driving their cars, you have to change mindsets. You've got to change values.
Okay. You'll notice that in much of the pictures that you see, actually you'd see them later on in this story were we to watch the whole thing, that it's women who are schlepping most of the wood and the fuel, and along with water, they'll spend most of their lives, they'll spend more time schlepping water and firewood and fuel than any other activity. So what are some of the solutions that we will talk about later and that I'd like to get us talking about very shortly? I want to bring your attention to one idea because it also touches on some of these themes that we've heard about a lot throughout this conference, and that is the role of women and the impact on women on some of these issues. Can we watch the Barefoot College excerpt?
The students are mostly women. Some are grandmothers. Hundreds have come here from villages across India and a dozen countries to learn how to install and maintain solar energy systems in rural areas. Even though it's sophisticated coursework, the only prerequisite for admission to the Barefoot College is that there are no prerequisites, not even to speak the language.
First time they've spoken Arabic.
Until we arrived with a translator, these Mauritanian women who'd been here 4 months hadn't spoken to anyone else in their native Arabic. But the college's founder says language is not a barrier to learning.
Our job is to show how it is possible to take an illiterate woman and make her into an engineer in 6 months and show that she can solar electrify a village.
Social entrepreneur Bunker Roy founded the Barefoot College in 1972, looking to use traditional knowledge and sustainable technology to help this impoverished desert region. It began with basics, like finding safe drinking water, then a few years later, solar.
In 1986, no one ever thought of solar electrification. It was far too expensive. But today, we have 50 kilowatts of panels on our roofs, all our 20, 30 computers, electronic machine, telephone exchange, all works off solar.
Today, solar energy drives not just the equipment, but a larger social experiment to improve the lives of some of the world's poorest people. It begins in the classroom, run by instructors who themselves have little or no formal education. Instruction is delivered with a mix of body language, a few essential terms in English, and a lot of hands-on practice. The students create an illustrated manual they'll take home. It's the closest thing to a diploma certifying their training as solar technicians.
I have been to 2 villages in Mauritania.
Roy was educated at elite schools on a path to medicine or diplomatic service before he founded the Barefoot College. The idea of self-reliant learning was inspired by Mahatma Gandhi, also by a legendary American.
Well, it's Mark Twain who said, never let school interfere with your education. School is something that you learn reading and writing. Education is what you learn from the family, from the environment, from the community.
Using grants from the UN and private foundations, Bunker Roy travels extensively in developing countries seeking potential students. The ones he does not want are city dwellers and, unless they're physically handicapped, men.
We've come to the sad conclusion men are untrainable. They expect too much. They're restless. If they're young, they're impatient. The first thing they ask even before the training starts is, do I get a certificate? They will use that certificate to get the worst job possible in a city. Whereas if we take middle-aged grandmothers to be trained, I don't have that problem of migration.
Okay. Our first panelist, T.H. Culhane, spent time in the halls of Harvard and UCLA, but he's also spent time in the Borneo rainforest, the inner city of Los Angeles, the Barefoot College, among many other places, and in Cairo most recently. And he's now a National Geographic emerging explorer, taking self-empowerment technologies to Egypt, Kenya, Tanzania, Nigeria, and Alaska, for starters. Interesting choice of interesting geography there, T.H., and I hope you'll enlighten. You seem less bothered by this hyper-urbanization, which seems to bother Bunker Roy. You're looking at building solar water heating systems and kitchen waste to biogas systems in the urban area. When you describe your projects, can you especially think about it in terms of, or share with us, in the context of scalability and growing these ideas beyond the cute stage that make good television?
Sure. I have to say first that the days that I spent at Barefoot College taught me more than I ever learned at Harvard or UCLA. Unfortunately, Bunker wouldn't let me stay long term because I'm a man. But I told him I'd try to take what he taught me out into the world, and he liked that. The world that I chose to take this kind of rural technology to was the city, and it follows a migratory pattern that has been causing urbanization and growth for the past 50 years or more. The lack of opportunities of people in the countryside, mostly because of land ownership issues, drives a lot of landless peasants to migrate to the cities in search of some opportunity. And then they get to the city, as you know, and they find that the ecosystem services that made their poverty somewhat bearable in the countryside are no longer available if the city's services are not provided to them, which were supposed to compensate for the subsidy from nature that they'd lost. Now, in shanty towns, informal communities, decaying slums in the city, this is unfortunately the case. There is not running water every day. There is not electricity every day, if there's electricity at all, if there's water at all. There is not sewage service. There's not garbage collection. So you don't have the things that made having a low income bearable. But that's not to say that the city can't provide these things. And I don't mean the municipality. I mean the environment of the city. I come to this field as an urban planner, and my faith is that for scalability, you're talking about numbers. And where are all the people? Where are the consumers? Where are the hands and the brains? And I don't want to quote somebody out of context and then have people think of certain things of me, but I admired Mao Zedong's quote that with every new mouth came 2 pairs of hands to feed it. And there's a lot of talk about you don't want to give a man a fish, you want to teach a man to fish. We always hear that. Then we get on the ground and say, well, is it true? What do you do with those 2 pair of hands? Well, when I moved into the slums of Cairo with my wife to do my dissertation and find out what were the barriers to solving these problems if you lived in a decaying, broken down, dysfunctional community. And I moved into the Islamic slum of Cairo next to the garbage collecting community of the Christian Coptic Zabaleen, or trash recyclers. We moved in an apartment that had water that only came on once or twice a week if it came on, electricity that went off whenever you didn't expect it, which made having a refrigerator impossible, which made having an electric heater impossible. And that challenge, making it personal, and talking with my neighbors and saying, oh, you don't have light either? What do we do? I realized I had something they didn't have, which made the crucial difference. I had access to credit. I had access to information, instructional material that I could read in several languages, fortunately. I had access to the world because I could travel without any restriction on an American passport. And so when my neighbors would say, oh, life is getting unbearable, we have all these ideas, but we don't have the way to do it, I'd say, I'll go try to find a solution to this. Now, you should know that as an academic, I never had any experience with my hands at all. I was a book guy. My entire growing up, my dad was writing about cartoons. I thought I was going to go into the film industry. For me, the idea that you could even take a plumbing wrench in your hand was an anathema. But I found in the slums of Cairo that there was plenty of intellectual capital there, that there were plumbers, there were glassmakers, there were welders. So what I realized is, instead of the usual mantra of giving people packages and services, the World Bank does sites and services, put a slab, put in water pipes, put in electric cables, put in sewerage stuff, and then it all falls apart because the central supplier isn't giving you the electricity and there's no place to send your garbage and the pipes break. I thought we should give people parts and patterns because they're well adept. Most of the poor communities I've worked in around the world, and you've been there too, I'm sure you've been there, are really adept at bricolage. They'll store stuff on their roof for years, an old tank, an old piece of pipe, thinking, what can I do with that? And why? Because when they came from, this is the Zabaleen case in particular, the garbage people, when they came from the countryside to the city, they moved in with all their animals into the city to harvest the city with the mentality of farmers, hunter-gatherers, scavengers, you name it. It's the age-old, millennia-old way that human beings have lived. We looked at our environments. Nobody told us, this is wilderness, this is countryside, this is city. No, it was like, this is geography, this is where you live. Make do. And they go, oh, that tree, I can sit under it. I could actually make a boat out of it. Really? A boat out of a tree? How do you get from there to there? Everybody that I lived with in the rainforests of Borneo had been really adept when motors would fail. This is why the rainforest experience was key. We were with the Dayak tribe back when I was 23, and the motor just dies on our outboard, and we're thinking, what do we do in the middle of the jungle? And this Dayak guy says, hold on a second. There's a tree that has a sap that I think we can use to, if we congeal it, we'll make a little rubber thing that we can fix the band that's broken. Goes off in the forest with his machete, cuts something, boils it up, fixes it, and then he repaired the motor. I thought, what? Well, the city turns out to be an even better environment for that because so many of the materials in the city have already been prefabricated. So if you're a rural migrant to the city, if you've been used to finding ways to use nature in its raw state, it's really a no-brainer to come up and say, well, you want to build a solution to your hot water problem. That was the low-hanging fruit for us. And we said, okay, we don't have any expertise, but I have some plans from Popular Science that I brought in this magazine. Can we replicate this? And I'll pay it. I'll take all the risk because it doesn't cost me more than $500 in materials, which for them is, a year's salary. So I go and I buy copper pipe and I buy glass and I talk to the glass cutter, cut it the right way, talk to the local welding guy. Can you weld it like it says in this picture here? And we experimented until we had a viable solar collector. It worked. Then it was, how do we store the hot water? Well, stainless steel tanks are too expensive for any of us. So one little boy, it was funny, if I can tell this anecdote, we were crossing from the Islamic part where I lived into the Christian part across the City of the Dead, which is an old graveyard area where squatters live. And little boys and little girls come up off and they tug at you and go, bakshish, bakshish, bakshish. They want money. And I said, in my Arabic, I said, I'm really sorry, but I just don't give money just for nothing. I mean, we got to have a relationship. You don't know me, I don't know you. Why would I give you something and then you'll feel bad because you took from me but didn't give anything back? I said, what can you do for me? What do you want? I said, what do you see? We're carrying copper pipes and boxes of aluminum across every day. We'll carry for you. How much you want? 5 pounds. Okay. We go walking across the City of the Dead. All these little boys are carrying, little girls are carrying stuff. They get up to the area where we're building. They look and they say, so what is this? And the other people working with us tell them, and they go, so where are you going to store the water? We don't know. We're looking for what we'd really like is a really big plastic tank, but we don't know where to get one. I know where it is. You do? Yeah, but you have to pay me. Okay. The kid takes us on a 45-minute walk through these narrow alleys into this little place where a guy has been taking Saudi Arabian shampoo barrels, and as they offload, they unload the shampoo, and they wash out the barrels, and he resells them for people to pickle olives. Who knew? This one guy has this shop. So these little boys take us there and demand their money, and they say, no, we want to be involved. Then we invented a way over the year of plumbing plastic tanks to handle both cold water and hot water supply. And it worked so well that USAID came and inspected and gave us a $25,000 grant to do small infrastructure and train people. And with that, we were able to build 35 solar hot water units in the Islamic community and the Christian community, but having members of both every day crossing the City of the Dead and sharing expertise.
Fascinating. Can you talk a little bit about the biogas projects that you have as well?
The biogas was the next stage in the journey. We had a lot of families, as I was doing my survey, did 900 households who didn't have access to sunshine. It's an urban environment. So a lot of people say, oh, it doesn't work in urban environments. There's big buildings blocking. What they did have was sunshine. Let there be light. What they did have is they had pigs and cows. Living on the 4th floor of one friend's apartment was a cow and a calf. Living on the roof were chickens and goats and ducks, and living by the bed was a donkey, and then there was pigs and a sow and her litter living on the staircase. And they had a lot of animal waste. And they said, surely we can turn this animal waste into something besides fertilizer. And I said, I've heard that you can turn it into biogas. I have no idea how. I'll tell you what, I've scheduled to go to India on a trip. I'll go and ask. And I can travel. So I went out to India and I started making inquiries, and I met Dr. Karve in Pune, you probably know from the Appropriate Rural Technology Institute, who agreed with me that if you take rural technology and apply it in the city, then you've turned the city into a place you can harvest. And he said, don't bother with animal waste except on the first day. That's your source of bacteria. What you want is their kitchen garbage because it produces 400 to 800 times as much biogas per kilogram as animal dung. Everybody's been getting it wrong for 300 years, he said. So we're focused on the city now. It's a greater source of energy. So we go back to Cairo after training with him, and we buy 2 rainwater barrels, the 1,000-liter one and the 750-round black one, And it's a simple thing. You put the 1,000-liter barrel on somebody's roof. You fill it the first day with dirty water, the dirtiest water you can find, so you don't worry about wasting water, and animal manure, which you get from, there's lots of animals in the community. And then you put the other barrel upside down in it with a valve on it. I think I had the valve with me. It doesn't matter. You put the valve on it, and you put a feeding tube inside, and you say, this is our sacred cow. This is its mouth. This is its throat. And you've built the stomach of the cow. It's got the bacteria, and that cow is going to burp and fart. And it's going to pee. And you put it on, people get that, because it's in terms they understand. Oh, I built a plastic cow. And then every day you feed your kitchen waste, and it goes in, and the next day it produces 2 hours of cooking gas on a single burner flame that's absolutely clean, no smoke whatsoever. And when I look at this, my heart breaks for the people who are still relying on combustion of heavy carbon fuels when methane is so easy to produce. The bacteria do all the work. Now, the selling point was hard at first. You talk about scalability. One of the wives of one of the men that I was working with, we like to train the women with the men at the same time, she raised objections about using bacteria gas in her kitchen because of the words that we used. Bacteria. And her husband said, okay, darling, what utility do you see from this? And I want to speak to this question of multiple utility. She said, I don't really care about the gas. I can buy Buddha gas. But I hate the garbage collecting flies and rats and sitting there. If it's a way of disposing of my garbage so that it doesn't smell and doesn't attract animals and rats, because the Zabaleen garbage people, by the way, are no longer collecting organic garbage because the government slaughtered all the pigs. And the pigs were the only way to turn at high value city garbage into things. So what she said is, I have a garbage problem. He said, well, Taha, that's what they call me, says that it'll turn it into fertilizer as well. She said, show me. So we built it, and now he started bottling the fertilizer. He didn't care about the gas. He was bottling the fertilizer that came out every day. As you pour food in, you get fertilizer out, and selling it to garden shops and putting money in his pocket. He said, darling, we have a new way of income generation. And then she said, now what about this gas? He said, well, I can show you on the roof. It's gas. It cooks. It doesn't smell. She said, okay, put it in the kitchen. Now, we have this idea that we don't ever try to put a technology in that does one task. So, for example, the solar hot water heater wasn't popular in one neighborhood. The drunken father of one of the young men and women that I was trying to train kept scoffing and going, this is a lot. We have my daughter. She goes every day into the street, like you showed. She goes to the water tap. She fills a bucket, carries it on her head, comes up, pours it in, heats it up on the stove, and gives me a bath. It's worked like that for generations. It'll work like that forever. I don't need to waste my roof space on a solar hot water system so it can turn a tap. And he liked his daughter doing that. She couldn't do anything else but fetch water and cook it, but he liked that arrangement. So he said, I don't want one on my roof. And then one day we were building on another roof, and I hired him as a truck driver to carry stuff. And he said, my son tells me that this thing, when you put it on the roof, you put it on an angle like this, and then you put a tank, and it takes the heat and throws it into that tank. I said, yeah. And he said, so if my goats were to live underneath the solar panels, would it be cool under there? It wouldn't just be shade, right? It would be cooler because the heat is going into the tank. I said, I never thought of that. He said, okay, why don't you come over and we'll build a goat shelter that just happens to give hot water. And he stayed up till past midnight building what he conceived of as a cooling goat shelter. And that idea caught on in his neighborhood. That's where the genius comes in here, and that's why I believe in parts and patterns rather than just saying, oh, we're going to give you solar energy.
Excellent. We've learned a great deal about the creativity that you find in communities and the ingenuity that comes from basic need and that's driven it. Again, getting to this theme of scalability, and we'll go to Peggy for this because when anyone thinks of China nowadays, scalability is probably the first thing that comes to mind because, I mean, there's been such unprecedented growth there. Along with India, there are probably a lot of people in China still working in unhealthy indoor air, for example, but China's made remarkable progress in dealing with this problem and in getting cleaner energy to people. What is it about, as you tell us about how China has gotten to where it is today over the past few years, can you tell us also about what one can extrapolate from that experience to the rest of the world? Because
all the time, it seems, we hear about China being unique and having its own way that isn't replicable elsewhere. So talk a little bit about China and how it's been able to get clean-burning stoves into its kitchen.
Okay, well, I'll talk a little bit about China. I will struggle a little bit more on how to actually take those learnings and apply it to the U.S. It might be easier to apply it to India.
That's what I mean. I mean, how do you get it out of China and to other parts, densely populated, especially South Asia, for example, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, where this problem is so acute of deforestation, and how do you build broad systems by which we're able to get cleaner burning stoves, for example, into people's small homes?
So first I'd like to preface my remarks by saying that We Juice, the NGO that I work at,
Can I interrupt for a second? I departed from Pat. I was going to introduce you with a little bio, and forgive me for this, because I got so taken by your presentation. I want to introduce Peggy before you continue, and forgive me for this. Peggy now runs something called JUICE, which is the Joint U.S.-China Commission on Clean Energy.
Collaboration on Clean Energy, yeah.
Collaboration in Clean Energy. She is an MIT-educated electrical engineer, computer scientist, Silicon Valley venture capitalist and entrepreneur, and has become, over recent years, a leading expert on the China energy landscape, and in fact lives today in Shanghai with her family. And let's get back to my question, and forgive me for the interruption.
So our NGO is really focused on changing the way China creates and uses energy. So the main drivers that we focus on are urbanization to consumer values to smart grid and industry use. We have recently had a program in Mongolia that I'd love to talk to Tej about, but I did have to do a little bit of research for this panel to talk a little bit about what China has been doing to get power to the poor. So the first thing that I'd like to do is define what poor means in China. As you know, there's 1.3 billion people in China today. In the last 30 years, they've lifted 600 million people out of poverty, from below the poverty line. So this is definitely a unique point in history. Nothing like this has been done before. The poverty rate dropped from 85 to 15.9%. If you look at all poverty reduction around the world, most of it has come from the efforts of China. So I actually found that out recently, and I was quite surprised. Now, most of this poverty came from rural areas. As my husband, Rob, in the audience likes to say, Mao, 30 years ago, wiped the slate clean in China. The nanny that works for us, our IE, spent her life being moved from the city to the rural areas to become a farmer. Now, after Mao's era, they gave each rural farmer a piece of land and animals, and this automatically lifted a portion of people. They gave sort of a baseline of income. So rural reforms was the number one thing to happen in China. But a lot of things since have happened that I think some are unique to China, some I think are lessons learned. So in the 80s, they started creating special economic development zones, which I think most of you have heard of. Shenzhen is an example. Now there's economic development zones. There's also science parks. I think this is one of the greatest strengths of China. A lot of people think China is a communist country. They actually describe themselves as a socialist market economy, I think is the term. So they don't think of themselves as communists. A lot of people think of China as a centralized authoritarian government. In fact, it's a lot of the decision-making happens at a local level, at the mayor's level, at the governor's level, at the provincial level. And one of the things that's happening in China right now is that they're experimenting. They're throwing billions of US dollars into experiments in clean energy and seeing what spaghetti sticks on the wall. And whichever one sticks, they're going to scale across the country almost immediately. So for example, a couple of years ago, one day in July, they decided that removing all free plastic bags, thin plastic bags from supermarkets was a good idea, that this experiment had worked, and boom, the nation had stopped giving free plastic bags. So in the 90s, they started privatizing SOEs, the industry. and this continued to rise China out of the poverty level. But in the last decade, what I think is really significant towards energy and power to the poor is the amount of infrastructure investment that China has put into place. So I think somebody in one of my breakouts had talked about Shanghai and the amount of high-speed rail, the amount of subways, et cetera. This is just one element of the tens of trillions of US dollars that China has put into the country in a very short period of time. And so now it only lags behind US in terms of amount of roads that exists. I think I read something that said that that was the main difference between China and India in terms of rising people out of the poverty level. I have a few interesting statistics that I'm just going to read off for you. One of the things that you should know that China has a distinct advantage in things like smart grid and rural electrification is that in the US we have 3,000 utilities. In China there's 2. And of the 2, one of them is the Goliath, one of them is David. And so this centralized utility is able to do things in a very large scale manner that I think the US or India would have a hard time doing. So a few things. Since 1998, China has spent $70 billion on building rural electricity grids. In 2001, they launched the first experiment called the China Township Electrification Program. This provided renewable energy to 1,000 townships. Some of you might know that we have a goal of 15% of all energy coming from renewable energy by 2020, which is, I think, a laudable goal. In 2006, the State Grid, which is the larger utility, launched something called the Power for All project. And now, from 2006 to now, they spent $2 billion on providing 1.2 million households, or 4.7 million people, with free electricity. So previously unconnected households now have electricity. What that means is farmers can not only buy their first air conditioner and refrigerator, but they can also stop hauling water and put in automated irrigation, which then increases agricultural crops and helps, again, the virtuous cycle. In the this decade, I should say, in the next 3 years, China plans to invest over $30 billion to upgrade its rural power grid. And it plans on having full rural electrification by 2015. Today, there's about 5 million people that don't have any form of electricity. The people in the rural areas that still have access to electricity, a lot of them have to supplement for heating and cooling and cooking. So they still use things like dung and et cetera. So in terms of scale, what JUICE is trying to do is learn from the work that we're doing in Mongolia right now. There's 100 schools in a particular province that's cutting down 550 tons of wood per school per season just to heat its schools. So I'd love to talk to you offline. We went there working with the UNDP, with the former advisor to the president, bringing in microfinance banks, bringing in all sorts of local resources to try and figure out a solution for these schools. And what we realized, I think the learnings that we've come across with in just the last 6 months is that a lot of things happening in the rural areas are happening through widget sellers. So it's either D-Light with a solar-powered lamp, somebody who's trying to have a carbon credit-based biomass program, and they're not getting a lot of scale in these areas. And I think that the thing that JUICE would like to really learn is how to integrate these for 3 main target audiences in the rural areas. One is farmers, by far the largest audience. The second one is schools, and then the third one is hospitals and other types of public services. System integration is not something that China is very strong at, because China is very good at widget building 1 million of a particular widget at very low cost. But if you try to give it Chinese people something where it's complex with new technologies, bring them together in new creative ways, very difficult for the whole mindset of the current Chinese educational system. This is changing. So one of the other things that we're trying to do is take these solutions that we find in the forms of case studies and scale it through a program we call the Energy Smart Cities Initiative. So this is something that we're under the contract of the Ministry of Housing and Urban Rural Development, or formerly called the Ministry of Construction, which is a lot easier to understand. And they contract out to JUICE to train, on average, 40 to 50 mayors at a time. Now, just to give you an idea of what a mayor means, it's not the mayor that you think of in the US. They're more like kings of a kingdom. There's over 150 million cities in China that have over 1 million people. So just to give you an example.
You say that again, 150?
There's over 150 cities. Okay. I don't know what I just said, but there's over 150 cities with over 1 million people. That's a really small city in China, very small. Just to give you a point of comparison, there's 9 cities in the US with over 1 million people, okay? So these mayors come to our training for up to 10 days at a time to look for solutions like this. And so what we want to do is take these solutions, maybe even by people like you, and show them, give them the access, because a lot of them have a hard time, even though they're a government official and they're king of their kingdom, they have a hard time getting permission to leave the country. Yeah, a lot of people think here that China is, you know, a threat, is competitive to the US or whatever. I think a lot of people don't realize a lot of Chinese people aren't even allowed outside of the country. So, and they're not really worried about competing with other countries. They're just worried about competing with other cities. So little side effect.
You know, hearing you describe it from the China-centric perspective is very interesting in many respects about how people feel inside the country. But from other parts of Asia, from a country like India, from parts of sub-Saharan Africa, where, by the way, China does send a lot of people who bring a lot of expertise to it. I guess many people look at China and say, how do they manage to get to where they are today? You know, and if we could define scalability narrowly along those lines, is it because of the system that's in place, the government that's in place that can declare that henceforth no more plastic bags or whatever? How do they get to a place where many other countries would love to get in terms of getting more people onto the electric grid and getting them to get off the stoves that they're cooking their food in?
Again, I think a lot of the points that I went through, the decollectivization or whatever, that can't happen. That's one point in history for one country, so that can't really be replicated. I think what can be replicated is the point where what's the difference between China and India, and it's the investment in infrastructure. My husband, who's an investor, can probably tell you a lot more about how in this recent or current financial crisis, one of the ways that China maintained its growth is the continual investment in its infrastructure.
Interesting. But you also have a market of people, maybe TH can briefly address this, in which we have less than $2 a day in income. How much of that income, how attractive would that be to an investor? And how do you build a sustainable social business in cleaner stoves, for example, for starters?
Well, if I can just parrot Hernando de Soto in his book, The Mystery of Capital, that $2 a day income figure doesn't reflect, of course, as we know, the vast resources that are there that are informal and therefore not codified, but represent forms of capital, whether it's household capital, whether it's social capital, intellectual capital, natural capital. I mean, when I say natural capital, the livestock assets in the city of the Zabaleen is a form of capital that doesn't get capitalized very easily and doesn't get put into the books. Even though they live in an informal community where they've built their own houses with their hands out of brick and cement now, that's an investment, and those houses have a market value. It's just because of strange land tenure relationships that have to be worked out, nobody knows what price to put on them. And the willingness to pay, there's still articulation with family members. This is extended family networks that go out to the countryside. I've been surprised to find that when we did a WTP, or willing to pay a study for the biogas systems and the solar systems, it was equivalent to or exceeded what people would pay for an appliance heater or an appliance gas stove, but there was no financing mechanism. The Egyptian economy has already worked out a way to offer the poor, say, an electric hot water heater for a 40-pound, which is about $5 down payment, and then you pay every month, 2 or 3 pounds until you pay it off, because they want to keep the poor from agitating. They want to keep them happy, but then they put them in, and then the electricity fails, and then the heating element blows up, and the thing is junk. It has to be scrapped. They produce their own solar panels, the same company that makes the electric heaters, but they offer no financing package, no advertising in Arabic. All of it's advertised in English for the elites, and nobody hears in the poor that they even have these assets, because they assume the poor couldn't pay, because we've told them solar is the holy grail. It's a high investment item. Nobody said to them in the parts model, if you just buy this is what they do in our situation. They get together with their families and they go, we're going to pool some money to buy the parts to build our solar panel. And they go to the local guy because it's keeping money in the community. Can we buy some glass for you? So-and-so is going to build it. It's a traditional mechanism in many poor communities. Everybody pools the money for one person to do it, and then they wait for another year or two, pool the money again for the next person to do something when they want to buy or have a wedding ceremony or something. So they use that mechanism, and it's all about, now we've built one panel. Like Hanafati, who I've taken with me as a young garbage collector, I took him with me to Tanzania and to Kenya and stuff. When I was training him, we built, because his family couldn't afford it, and I didn't want him to be getting just a gift, we built one panel, one small tank. It was enough to take one shower. Now he has 3 panels, 2 large tanks, because of the incrementalist nature of urban development in the slums. We call it incremental housing in the literature. They don't buy a house and it's like, oh, I can turn on this and there's the ice maker and this. No, they build and you see it looks horrible, and they say, don't look at it as it looks today. See how we see it. 25 years ago, this was a shanty town built of cardboard. Now it's concrete houses. The walls are bare and they're ugly. But the mother of Hannah, she's an old woman who remembers when the city burned down because pigs caught on fire and spread the fire throughout the whole city. So when we rebuilt, I said, one day when my grandchildren occupy this place, the beauty is going to be astonishing. And you see this, and you go into some people's houses, and the whole thing is a wreck, and then one room is beautiful.
Yeah. But Fred, you were asking about investment, though, right?
Who's going to go in there and create a system? And you and I talked about this earlier, in which you're treating people who make $2 a day as respectable consumers who have rights as consumers. Who is going to service the stove when it breaks down?
Yeah.
We're going beyond, the household cottage industry.
Two sort of more commercial examples, though. One is Bauto in Inner Mongolia. Pepsi, which owns Lay's potato chips, was having a hard time finding enough potatoes to create big enough potato chips to service China. And so they went to Inner Mongolia, and over the last 10 years, they've taken 10,000 acres or more and planted them with potato plants. And so Hu Jintao has actually been there in 2005 because this is what they call win-win-win. So it's win for the local people, it's win for Pepsi, it's win for the environment. So that's one example of something really large scale that the rural areas can benefit from. The other one is one of our students in our class last month came up to us and they said, I'm the mayor of a coal mining town and we're running out of coal. This, by the way, is pretty common in China. We would like to turn part of our city into ecotourism. So I think that's considered rural. I'm not sure, but anyway. So I think that's one. Maybe that's a better topic for my Exurbia talk tomorrow. And then the third one, which I don't think has worked at all, which is programmatic CDM. So carbon credits for things like. Are you shaking your head because no, it didn't work? Yeah. And now with Copenhagen,
it has had a difficult time getting off the ground. But and I'm hoping we'll get eventually to thinking about how we spread and create enterprises in villages. Now, Bunker Roy's women who attend this college, he's graduated about, I think, 700 or 800 of these women who've gone on to their villages and started little enterprises selling this thing, selling solar panels to people in solar lighting. And they're there. They're always there. They are the warranty provider, I imagine, and they've created it. And and part of what we're grappling with, obviously, is how do you create a more massive scale so that this can scale up. We're still talking about a drop in the bucket, eventually. And
I think what TH was saying, though, it's about access to technologies. Because what we found in Mongolia is when we brought the D-Light solar lamps, they had never seen it before, and they were like, "How can we get our hands on this? Because we could have sold 200 today." So I think if there was a system integrator for rural technologies, and then you bring it to channels, like I was talking to 51 Give, which does microfinance technologies in China. They have access to all the microfinance loan officers. So the microfinance loan is like banks. So all the farmers go through them to get microfinance. Guess what? You could have a little demo room of all the technologies that you've run into, right? So I think people need to think more on a standard marketing, technology marketing manner when it comes to rural, and not just think of them as rural.
And the systems integrator, just finally before we move on and globalize this, the systems integrator, whose role is that going to be institutionally overall? I mean, is there a role for multilateral bodies to start creating this, or national bodies to create a better system? And you've talked about it at the grassroots level, teaching in schools.
Can I be provocative? It should have been the role of the schools, both here in the United States and abroad, and instead we're teaching what I think are useless curricula that focus on trying to get to a stage where maybe you can be an entrant into the global market as a businessman, a lawyer, a doctor, whatever. We don't meet people where they are with their aspirations, and we don't teach them anything about self-capacitation. We think that reading and writing is the be-all and end-all, reading, writing, arithmetic. And I was I brought science education to vocational training in the ghettos of LA for 10 years. And boy, oh boy, when you say you're going to learn science because you're going to build an electric car as we did, or you're going to build an alcohol-powered car, which we did, or an ethanol still, a solar-powered still, in the ghettos of LA, all those gang members suddenly become your best allies, and they want to be in science class on the weekends. And that's one of the greatest experiences I had as a teacher, was when you turn the curriculum and say, okay, forget the textbook. Whoop, out it goes. You want to build a hot rod, but it should be clean. Then they learn all their science, and I think that that's true in Egypt, it's true in China.
Vocational training is a huge opportunity for clean energy, huge.
Excellent. Why don't we move on and see where we fit in, from the United States. And you, Richard Cizik, you've been a lobbyist for the National Association of Evangelicals for 3 decades, where you championed the issues like climate change, which one does not frequently hear from groups like the National Association of Evangelicals, and you eventually parted company on another social issue, the subject of another forum. Richard is a prolific writer and author, most recently and co-chair of a task force on religion and the making of U.S. foreign policy. And the question I have for you is, you look at images such as the ones we saw, they couldn't seem more distant than the images, than the lives of who we envision as evangelicals. How do you think we can engage a population such as the one you represented in Washington in issues such as this, which are so central to climate change?
I think that's a real challenge. How do you change, for example, in this country, 70 to 100 million people? Now, you can say we can do that with the environmentalists. And Gus Speth, certainly the head of the Yale School of Forestry and Environment, Gus Speth is a premier environmentalist. He says, I thought we could do that. He said, I thought that for 30 years. This is Gus. He said, I thought we could change policy with the environmentalists. He said, then I thought we could do it with the scientific community. I thought that too. And then he said, I decided, in a famous quote that is distributed around my community at least, he said, I decided that we couldn't do any of that until we changed people's hearts and created a will to change and think differently about these issues. And then he said, and that's your job. That's why we in the environmental, the scientific, the business, the investment community, and that's why we need the religious community to do this, because that's your business. And that's what happened to me. My story is essentially that I had worked for 28 of some 30 years living under a paradigm that was wrong-headed, that essentially said it didn't matter. The environment didn't matter. And that's the way millions and millions of Americans still live. And yet a revolution, I'm happy to say, is occurring in which, one, people are learning to think differently, think clearly about these issues of climate change and its impact on the poor. And the Evangelical Climate Initiative, released in 2006, has 250 of the largest leaders of ministries, parachurch ministries, faith-based groups and others in this country who are committed to doing this. It's interesting, though, that the movement among the conservative religious community on climate change has precipitated a reaction. And the reaction is from the right of the right. You know, there's always a question, you know, what is the right thinking, what is the far right thinking? Well, the far right thinking has, I'm happy to say, they have come as well to a conclusion that global climate change is really important as a social issue. And so both the advocates of climate change within my movement, of which I am one, and those that oppose action, such as the cap and trade bill, or for that matter, a carbon tax, they also happen to agree it's really important, especially as it impacts the poor, because they get that from the common biblical mandate that we share. They just happen to differ on the causes, the consequences, and the policy implications. And so there's a lot of pushback, but together we believe we have to have a new vision to think more clearly about this. We have to have a strategy. And I say a vision without a strategy is a hallucination. But the strategy, quite frankly, I would appeal to you in the scientific, the environmental community, and others who are here, or my friend Joe, who's in the investment community and is also a leader in the environmental world. I would appeal to all of you to say that we can't do this any more than you can do this. Shift this 700 to 100 million people, 1/3 of America, to think differently without your help. And so the strategy from my vantage point has been to collaborate with science and scientists. And so David Brancaccio, for example, helped host a program in Alaska that brought together the scientists of America with the evangelical leaders in a program aired called God and Global Warming. You can just click it on the web. You can watch it. It's a 30-minute program aired on Now last year. So the strategy is not just to engage bridging outward, as Robert Putnam from Harvard argues, not just with scientists, not just with environmentalists, and that's the report, which you're welcome to have a copy of. It's right here, from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, in which 30 of the United States' best thinkers say, we can't do what you're talking about, TH, what you're talking about, or Sam, what you're leading us to talk about. We can't do this without changing this religious community in America.
So what's going to galvanize them? You say that there is a mandate to serve the poor. Is that the issue that's going to bring a collaboration that's going to get them to engage with this issue?
Fundamentally, it's really important. But what you also need to know, and shouldn't leave without recognizing, is that probably the bigger revolution that is occurring in all of Christendom is that for the first time, theologians are now saying that we have to shift our entire frame of reference from thinking as Christian people that our primary purpose is to live and die and go to heaven, which has been certainly a staple of evangelical preaching, from that to the idea that our whole purpose here on this planet Earth is to be co-participants with God in both the creation, the redemption, and the renewal of creation. And if people change the way they think, that way, it's not just a matter of collaborating together to aid the poor, which is a mandate, but it's shifting completely from seeing, I would say, this world in one way to beholding it in a completely different way. And that is very, very threatening. Very threatening to certain people in the theological community who have a vested interest. I turned on the radio this morning and I heard the local preacher preaching from Revelation and the end times. But it's very threatening to some people to think that this is our role. Lastly, I would say, in addition to strategy, you have to have a tactic. And a friend of mine has written a book. It's called The Power of Sustainable Thinking. His name is Bob Doppelt. He's at the University of Oregon. And what Bob says is that you do not shift people and the way they think without people who are disturbances. He says, it just happened to be that, I'm a disturbance in the religious community. You're a disturbance. We're each disturbers.
Can you use a different metaphor?
Yeah, maybe a better one. But in a good sense. in other words, we are provoking a disequilibrium between people's status quo thinking and their highest and best ethics and their ethical knowledge of what they really believe they should be doing on the planet. But without somebody to be a provoker, a disturber of that status quo, they will not make the shift. But they have to have a second thing. They have to have, in addition to that provoking of their thinking, a kind of cognitive dissonance. They have to have solutions that they know, if they act on, will work.
Okay.
And in their own personal lives, if they make that shift, I say they will move from deny, which is where a lot of people are still at in this country. Let's face it. Not everybody in this country believes what we believe here. But they will move from deny or disinterest to deliberate. I'm thinking about this. I may do this. To design, I will do it. To doing it, to defending it. And those are the 5 Ds. But just getting some people from deny or disinterest to deliberate is a big shift.
Thank you. Finally, to Tom Horton. Thanks for your patience as we've deliberated. Tom is an author and a frequent writer in National Geographic, Rolling Stone, the New York Times, an environmental writer focused on issues about the Chesapeake Bay. But you've read and traveled in the Philippines in particular. How do you make some of these issues less relevant globally to us?
I think whether you're talking about Chesapeake Bay or the Philippines or India, the one thing that comes back to me more over and over again in about 40 years of writing about environments, generally the cleanest, greenest technological solutions don't get you where you think they're going to. It's not that you don't want to do them. For God's sake, if we hadn't had a lot of technological breakthroughs during my life, we'd be swimming in sewage. But they don't get you where you think they're going to unless a couple things happen. One, that they are part of a more comprehensive solution, and other speakers have touched on this. Two, I'm pretty convinced that no matter what clean, green technologies you implement, if you do it in a society that continues to grow population-wise and consumption-wise at a fairly rapid rate, that's going to defeat you or make progress a lot less than you'd hoped. I was able to spend a few weeks recently, a couple of years ago, in the Philippines. U.S. and the Philippines have a long-standing relationship, and a lot of NGOs and the U.S. government have spent a lot of money over a lot of decades on a lot of projects to improve the life of Filipinos, and not with nearly as much success as they would have liked. And what I was over there looking at was a number of pilot projects, some of them pretty large, some small, that had been undertaken with funding from the Packard Foundation, involved USAID, involved the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, a number of NGOs, local and US-based. What they had found, and these pilot projects had demonstrated this to the point that they felt the next step was really to scale it up. That hasn't happened too fast because Packard in the tech bubble collapse went from an $80 billion to a mere several billion-dollar foundation. But what they found was that they called it PEH, Population, Environment, and Health, that you needed to look at all three of these. Now, if you went to a community, one of them was a small island that had become impoverished, their fisheries had declined, they were blowing up the coral reef and poisoning the reefs to get more fish, kind of desperation, not very sustainable. What they were really interested in there had nothing to do with population or environment. They wanted a better well. They were having water problems. That's an entry point. So these coalitions of NGOs came in, okay, we'll do a new well. By the way, would you like to talk a little bit about family planning? In fact, an awful lot of the women there did. You have to kind of run under the radar of the Catholic Church to do this in the Philippines, but it seems to happen. Then they went from there to really a pretty full-blown family planning agenda, had water, then started bringing in ways to solve the environmental problem, showing them that there was a market in Japan for a type of seaweed that they could grow instead of blowing up the reef, and on and on. And they had pursued this agenda, again, usually coming in with just one entry point. You know, don't try to say you need to get your population under control. Makes more sense to say, what's your problems here? Talk about that. And they had worked everywhere from some of the worst urban slums in Manila, where they were actually making some real progress cleaning up the river, which people realized was a source of disease. But again, that wasn't primarily why they wanted help initially. It had to do with some land issues in that case, property issues. But it convinced me, and I believe they had also extended this population, environment, health, comprehensive approach to a couple pilot programs in Madagascar. They were working in the Philippines and in Madagascar because these are hot spots globally of biodiversity. That was sort of the impetus for this whole program, but it was actually helping people too. So I take from that, and one aside, I was a little chagrined, although not shocked, to find that people in the Philippines, these impoverished, undereducated people, much, much more readily accepted the fact that they needed to get population under control than all the environmentalists I know in the U.S. They don't want to talk about it at all. It's a big part of our problems on Chesapeake Bay, but you won't find it written down anywhere. We'll just keep on adding more sewage treatment plants and hoping for the best. So I actually think we have some lessons to learn from some of these less developed countries sometimes. And that's really, you know, I think that the comprehensive approach and the realization that you really have to pay attention to the numbers of people and how they are consuming, how much and in what ways, to make green technologies, clean technologies work to their maximum.
And I'm impressed by how you put it, which is you've got to understand where people are at home in their own lives. The insight, for example, that Filipino women really want to talk about family planning issues, for example.
They do. We mentioned earlier, and it's worth mentioning, a friend of mine, Bob Engelman, who works at World Watch, has written a very interesting book, and its title is More, and the More something what women really want. I accused him of putting it on there just to sell books to every woman, but Bob's thesis, he goes back through the history, back to ancient times of contraception and birth control. And his thesis is that throughout history, throughout cultures, if you stripped away the political and cultural and religious pressures on women, women never wanted big families. And if you left it to women throughout history and culture, you probably wouldn't have 6.9 billion people.
Okay, we've got a few minutes, and we'll open it up for questions or comments. And I apologize for us being very limited in the amount of time we have. Hang on for a microphone, we'll get it to you.
Hi, Sarah Laskin from National Geographic. I was very pleased to hear a lot of the conversation focused on benefits that were sort of secondary to the solution to the problem that was being asked. In a way, it was sort of disappointing in Raj Pachuri's piece to really only focus on the Pareto optimal economic solution to the climate and carbon release crisis, because there were so many other issues going on with those women and the cooking. But how, I mean, you guys are already thinking about that. How do you bring that back into the rest of the conversation about addressing environmental issues? There were so many health, poverty, and other things that could be hurdled over through these things. And it seems like they're being ignored in the conversation, and it's frustrating.
Just to take a volley of that, if you're talking about how the poor people that we've been working with around the world then get involved with climate change and large environmental issues, we never started as that as a focus, obviously. We focused on health. We focused on what the people needed in terms of what they said about their infrastructure, making sure that there was no lung disease because of smoke, things like that. But once we had built systems together and everybody was operating it, we then said, hey, you know what? There's this larger issue out there, and the proof that they're concerned about it was when, after we had done this and we were invited by the 350.org to present, everybody in both the Islamic and Christian communities we'd built in said, can we go and speak with you at this 350.org conference? And we all went together, and they got up on stage with photographs of their systems and said, by solving problems in our households, we solve the world's problems. We want to be part of this dialogue because we're the solution, not just the problem. That, I think, speaks to that.
Anybody else want to add something? We'll come to you next. Go ahead.
Good morning. I'm Jacob Scher with the Natural Resources Defense Council. In spite of the failure of the Senate to pass climate legislation last week, it appears that there's going to be significant new monies flowing from the United States and other countries to address climate change mitigation throughout the developing world, with hopefully significant increased amounts of money going to deal with the energy poverty problem that we've been talking about today. And I'd be interested in the response to the panelists about, are we going to be able to use, instead of now maybe $100 or $200 million a year that's going into this field, perhaps a few $billion a year that would be going to address this problem? Are the systems in place to make sure that the money kind of flow effectively to the rural communities where you've all been working? I see somebody shaking their head.
No, I'm really disappointed, actually. Something similar when the financial crisis hit, and there was $11 billion by the US DOE set for smart grid. Turns out there's only one guy in the entire Department of Energy that's in charge of smart grid. So how is this one guy going to possibly know the best way to allocate $11 billion? I think it's the same thing if you multiply it across that money to the different countries, to the different programs. I think what we need, I'm a little biased because I come from Silicon Valley, from the internet era, but I think we need a Web 2.0 clearinghouse of all the energy projects, what the barriers are, what are the goals that everybody's trying to achieve, because not all of us have, well, I certainly don't have a PhD, I don't even have a master's, I didn't even study energy. So how am I supposed to know what the barriers are, what am I trying to achieve if I want to dedicate some of my limited resources onto a project? Whether it's money or in-kind resources. So I think somebody out there needs to create a Web 2.0 wiki-like thing or Facebook for energy projects.
Running out of time. Richard, did you want to add something to that?
Well, I would only say that you can't do this even there, wherever it is. Morocco, for example, or any other part of sub-Saharan Africa, without engaging with the communities there that make the most amount of difference, who are doing it. And they happen to be there, the religious communities. And it so happens that in the year 1900, 67% of the globe was part of the four main religions: Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism. Sorry. And so that figure by 2050 will be 80%. Will be in those four major religions. And so my answer is that I don't think policymakers, I don't think they're anywhere prepared to even, at this point, allocate the dollars for adaptation and mitigation that those of us in the religious community have asked for. They seem very resistant to allocate any dollars from a cap-and-trade program or otherwise. But I do believe it's going to happen, that $100 billion annually that was talked about in Copenhagen. It's going to happen, but don't expect to do it without, without the collaboration of these communities. I'm talking about the values communities that really do care about this issue.
Okay, we have time for one more quick question. It is now.
My name is Joe Stanislaw, my own company in the energy business, investment business. I've been in it for 30 years. I regret this was not a plenary session. I think it was unbelievably powerful, and I congratulate you all for what you're thinking and what you're doing. My question is, I won't go into my details of what I do, but I'm on the board of a company to create a foundation to go into very poor countries and use our technology we're producing to get them into those economies through microfinance and other things. A lot of our purpose was to help women, and it is to help women. And behind the scenes is...
I like you already.
Well, thank you.
We do too.
But part of our purpose was to promote democracy through these technologies, these local technologies in these rural areas. Is that any part of your thought process? And we did this because Bush came to power and said, I'm going to promote democracy in the Middle East and all this kind of stuff. And we thought the best way was to give people independence. And independence in terms of having clean water, energy, sanitation, which you get from all these things, however you do it. So behind our thought process was, this could help promote democracy by helping to liberate women. So is that any of your thinking there?
I can say that my program started after September 11th, 2001, when the State Department actually invited me to be part of their Changing Hearts and Minds Powell Doctrine program. It's twice a year. They sent me till 2007 all over the Middle East to promote democracy through renewable energy technology and infrastructure construction at the local level. And the idea that they paid for when they sent me to places like Palestine and Jordan, you name it, Oman, Syria, was based on the work in Cairo and your thing about Web 2.0, the ET community, energy technology, should be like the IT community was, where it's basically you open up parts suppliers, third-party suppliers, added value, so you have your Radio Shacks and your fries. That's democracy. And you say, did you know you can provide your own energy for your community, and we're not going to put any barriers up. Go and get off-the-shelf parts and cobble together your own computer, cobble together your own energy system. If that were true, the democracy would happen, because both men and women both have the bricolage mentality. They want to contribute parts. So yes, there was an overt agenda during the Bush administration for those of us who were lucky to get that kind of funding. I just don't know why it was never ramped up. You're quite right.
Can I say something? We can talk offline. I grew up in the U.S. I'm an American. I only moved to China 6 years ago, so my perspective, I think, is very balanced between U.S. and China. But I think for today's challenges, we live in a very unique time in history where democracy is not necessarily the best solution. I think that climate change, a lot of people approach it from a technology lens with carbon capture sequestration or nuclear or what have you. A lot of people, Energy Foundation might be pushing on policy, but frankly, a lot of the policies are pretty good in China. They need to be enforced, they need to be monitored. I think what we're really having an issue with is a standard management consultant change management problem. And somebody needs to figure out, how do you articulate the problem? How do you align incentives, which is the way I like to describe what you talked about? How do you align incentives between the different stakeholders? And with China's form of government, not communism, but socialist market economy, they have an ability to do change management and change very, very rapidly. So I'm not in total agreement that that's the best way to improve the lives of, or give independence to people.
Okay, on that note, we are out of time. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you, panelists, so much. It's been a great privilege to listen to you.